Hi, my name is Samantha Hill. I'm the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Um, and welcome to our virtual reading group. Somebody has their mic on. Thank you. Sorry. Sometimes the mic gets on and then the audio cuts out. This summer we are reading Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind, and we are in the first volume, Thinking. Mohammed, I think you keep turning on your microphones. Just it keeps popping up and interrupting the audio from my end. If you could just click that off, that would be great. So I this week we had two sections to read, Invisibility and Withdrawal, and the intramural warfare between thought and common sense. And it wasn't a lot of reading, but it's incredibly dense. And I think that Arendt is really touching on a lot of the key elements that she associates with the process and activity of thinking in these two sections. And what I wanted to do was take a look at a section and then just kind of outline some of the elements that she's talking about in terms of thinking that I think are really held nicely on page 67 in my volume here in the first section on invisibility and withdrawal, beginning with the paragraph, although this last category of thought objects. Give everyone a chance to find it. So she says, although this last category of thought objects, concepts, ideas, categories, and the like became the special subject matter of quote unquote professional philosophy, there is nothing in the ordinary life of man that cannot become the food for thought, that is, be subjected to the twofold transformation which prepares a sense object into a suitable thought object. So I'm just going to pause there, and I just kind of want to work through this paragraph because I think it contains a lot of what she's saying. So one of the ways in which thinking as an activity that we engage in for Arendt differs from theory, theoria, political philosophy proper, as we might conceive of it, is that we experience the world sensually, right? So we go out into the world, we have experiences, we perceive our experiences through our senses, and then we represent those experiences to ourselves through our imagination in the process of thinking. And that representation of our experiences then becomes I always think of it very materially as the subject matter of our thinking, right? That we then engage in a process of thinking about. So we already have this kind of, twofold movement happening where we sensually experience the world, and then we represent those sensual experiences we have of the world to ourselves. And in that, for those of us who are, paying attention to the philosophical work that she's doing, although she's intentionally calling herself not a philosopher, in part for this reason here, is she's turning against the systematic philosophies of Kant and Hegel, which she gets to at the end of our second session for today, in order to think in part about the difference between thinking as this process that we engage in, which is sensual and based upon our experiences in the world, and the systematic philosophies that try to teach us how to know the world through processes of rational thinking. So the next sentence, she says, all the metaphysical questions, and remember she says at the beginning, and she says it throughout the life of the mind, that she's engaging in the process of dismantling metaphysics, right? She's not doing away with it in my reading. She's engaging in this process of taking it apart. All of the metaphysical questions, which became the special topics of philosophy, arise out of ordinary common sense experiences, right? So here's this other dualism that she's presenting us with, which becomes the subject of our second section for today, where we have ordinary common sense experiences. As people who appear in the world, we experience the world, and we have these common sense experiences. And then we engage these common sense experiences in our thinking. But these common sense experiences become special topics of philosophy, which she sees as somehow removing them from the language of common sense, which is very important for the way that she's thinking about how we make thinking appear in the world through language. And then she goes on to say, I lost my the quest for meaning, which prompts men to ask them, is in no way different from men's need to tell the story of some happening of which they were witnesses or to write poems about it. Right? So we have this idea of storytelling and in this feeling, this being compelled to think about, to talk about, to tell our experiences and stories, to record them in poems, to write about them. And in all such reflecting activities, men move outside the world of appearances and use a language filled with abstract words, which of course had been long part and parcel of everyday speech before they became the special domain of philosophy. For thinking then, though not for philosophy, technically speaking, withdrawal from the world of appearances is the only essential precondition. And so this is a really important distinction that she's drawing between her conceptualization of thinking as an activity that we engage in and the proper work of the Kantian professional philosophers. In order to engage in this process of thinking, we have to completely withdraw, we never completely withdraw from the world, but we have to withdraw from the world of appearances, right? We go into that space of solitude, which she talks about in a couple of pages, where we engage in that two-in-one conversation with ourselves reflectively, where we draw those invisibles of thinking into our imagination and we contemplate them and think about them. There, we can transform them into thought things which will appear in the world through language, through what she's calling here abstract language, like metaphor and poetry, that allow them to appear. So thinking does not appear in the world for Arendt. It's always invisible, but our fundamental human condition is one of appearance. And so we never escape the world of experience altogether when we engage in the act of thinking, which is moving away from, she'll give the example of Plato's famous cave, in the next section, the idea that we can somehow escape the realm of human affairs and move into a pure realm of ideas where truth is located, is a kind of transcendental gesture that Arendt is pushing us away from. She sees it as unworldly thinking. And so she's I read this as trying to conceptualize thinking as a worldly activity that we in, where thinking has to move not from otherworldly ideas, but from experiences in the world that we have, these kind of common experiences that are particular, but are also shared and can be shared through language. And just to finish this paragraph here then, so in order to think about somebody, he must be removed from my presence. So long as we are together with him, we don't think either of him or about him. Thinking always implies remembrance. Every thought is strictly speaking an afterthought. It may, of course, happen that we start thinking about somebody or something that is still present, in which case we have removed ourselves surreptitiously from whatever our present surroundings are and are conducting ourselves as though we were already absent. So our thinking always deals with invisibles, and it deals with remembrance. And we are representing our experiences to ourselves, and we engage them in thinking. We are engaging in a form of remembrance. There's a really lovely passage that I like a lot, actually, in Origins of Totalitarianism, in the section on anti-Semitism, where she draws on Proust to make this argument. She describes him as kind of holding up this mirror to the mind's eye, where he can see the objects of experience and remember them, and then draw them into conversation. And I see her thinking about it in a similar way. So I want I'm going to, there's more to say. I know Roger is on the call and might have to jump off early, but I think that those are some of the key elements of thinking that she's drawing our attention to in these two sections, and how she's thinking about the tension between her conception of thinking as something that is essential and the ideal world idea of thinking in the way that the professional philosophers have traditionally thought about thinking. Yeah.
Sam, could I just ask you what page this passage starts? Because I can't find it.
Daphne?
In my book, it's 10, add 10 pages to
okay.
Samantha.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. I have a digital copy since I'm traveling at the moment.
Samantha, hi, it's Margaret. I have a question about an earlier section in this section. For me, it's pages 72 and 73. And
okay,
what you were just discussing seems to be premised on the stuff that I'm referring to. And what I'm unclear about is how she...
Margaret, you cut out?
Let me...
All I heard how...
Let me try. Can you hear me?
I heard that, yes.
Oh, okay. What I'm trying to figure out is how she can draw such a tidy line between thinking and the passions. Too, she says,
Also,
thinking is a...
So I think you're cutting out a lot, but I think I get I don't know if you're cutting out for other people, but I hear you asking how does she draw a distinction between thinking and the passions, which she does on 72, 73, I think in your volume, and it's so let me I'll look at the passage here. I think it's on the bottom of 72. So she's talking about this element, this quality of invisibility, right? And this juxtaposition between what appears and what does not appear, and what activities appear in the world and which ones don't appear in the world but are conditioned by appearance. So the activities of thinking as an activity, thinking, willing, judging. Thinking does not appear in the world, but it's conditioned by our appearance in the world. The soul, likewise, for Arendt, does not appear in the world. I cannot see your soul. And so she says, in this, as in other respects, the mind is decisively different from the soul. And so now she's drawing the distinction. Its chief competitor for the rank of ruler over our inner non-visible life. The invisibility of the soul, where our passions, our feelings, our emotions arise, a more or less chaotic welter of have not an act but suffer, and which in case of great intensity may overwhelm us as pain or pleasure overcome and overwhelm us. And similar to the invisibility of our inner bodily organs, of whose functioning or non-functioning we are also aware without doing anything and without being able to control. The life of the mind, on the contrary, is sheer activity, and this activity, like other activities, can be started and stopped at will. The passions, moreover, though their seat is invisible, have an expressiveness of their own. We blush with shame or embarrassment, we grow pale with fear and anger, we can shine with happiness or look dejected. And we need a considerable training in self-control in order to prevent the passions from showing. The only visible outward manifestation of the mind is absent-mindedness and obvious disregard for the surrounding world, something entirely negative which in no way can hint at what actually happens within us. So this is a very important distinction for Arendt between the kind of inner economy of our psychic, emotional life. Thinking as an activity that we actively engage in is something that we practice, right? The two-in-one conversation that Arendt describes as thinking is something that we consciously do as an activity, where we draw ourselves into conversation and we think about our experiences in the world. And there's an element, there's a quality of, I just used the word practice, right? There's a quality of practice in that for Arendt, but there's also a quality of control, which she doesn't see the passions as having. So the passions and the feelings that move within us are, she says, you know, in this I think penultimate sentence, that we have to practice to learn how to control them, to direct them in some way. But maybe a good comparison would be, you know, there's for her the feeling of being carried away by love or infatuation is not that different from being overcome with a bout of nausea. They're bodily sensations that are provoked by something internally or externally that are not subject to contemplation in a way that we engage them actively as an activity. And so she's drawing a kind of mind-body distinction here, but it's different than the classical mind distinction within philosophy, is the way that I read that, which I imagine is quite controversial because, you know, now we have affect theory and people try to mobilize the passions in political projects to certain ends. And they certainly have become a subject of a lot of contemporary political philosophy. But this is also one of the reasons why Arendt dislikes Rousseau, is that he puts the passions at the center of his political and philosophical thinking when he's talking about the state or equality, you know, feelings like empathy, of being moved by the sight of suffering of another. For her, that's not an active activity of thinking. That's allowing ourselves to be, I think, carried away by the body. And the body traditionally has always gotten in the way of the mind for those who want to think metaphysically. Margaret, I imagine that might be a kind of answer, but is probably not the answer you want, but I'm not sure. Let's see.
Ask a question.
Can't thinking, so you followed up. Yeah, Nancy?
Okay, so I'm thinking about this Killick Asst 7-line poem from about 680 BC, the pre-Platonic, at which there is a conversation with the thumos, with the center of emotions.
Yes.
And it's an exhortation. It's sort of influenced by Odysseus's conversations to his thumos when he gets in trouble. And it seems to match, but I've just the thumos is kind of convoluted in misery, and it's an exhortation for it to rise up. And the last line, it's a series of imperatives. And the last line is, and gnoska, know what sort of ruthmos governs humankind, anthropos. So I'm just thinking about it as in Arendt terms, and one wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yeah. Well, will you please post the poem in the chat box so that we can read it, because I don't know it, but it sounds very dialogic, and it resonates in an Arendtian sense, your description of it. You know, I think, you know, Arendt's not foreclosing the passions as the sensual embodied experience that we have as a subject of thinking. And the poem that you're describing, it sounds like you know, a conscious engagement with the experience of the emotions. You know, emotions are something that we experience: shame, lust, guilt. I can't think of any others right now. I'm not good with emotions, but I'm sure there's more. And you know, we experience them. And we have, you know, many experiences of the emotions throughout a given day. And, you know, I think that doesn't mean, for Arendt, we can engage them, right? But do we let them overrun us and dictate to us, or can we treat the emotions as an experience of the self that we can engage in a dialogue with? And she's not, I mean, this isn't any kind of, I'm not offering any kind of stoic reading here. That's not what I mean at all. It's not, can we become in, can we, I think the example she gives here, can you be happy when you're burning at the, this is not the point for her. But, how do we approach our experiences of passions? And the way that we think about the activity of thinking is different than the way that we think about the activity of experiencing the passions. So the passions are something that we experience as a response to some external stimuli, and thinking is something that goes on inside of us, which is also conditioned by the world of appearances, but is an activity that we are actively engaging in. It's not, I'm going to be happy today and I'm consciously going to engage in the activity of happiness, right? So it's fundamentally different in that sense for Arendt and the way that I'm reading these passages.
Could you also, I'm sorry, I have another question about Plato and the cave, and also the horse and chariot imagery in the Phaedrus. But I'm wondering if we could tease out a little more the difference between the Platonic notion of, I don't know, I think it's the white horse that controls the charioteer has, I haven't read it recently and I'm getting it mixed up, but the notion of the horse that's out of control, and then the charioteer controlling and giving the white horse the rein, so the white horse guides the soul or something like it. I guess it's an image of a tripartite soul, and it's sort of, sometimes when you teach it, it's sort of connected to Freud's ego, id, and superego kind of. Some people make that connection. So
what
I'm
page
just
is
trying.
it on?
It's not. Oh, she just.
This is from the This is from the Phaedrus.
Phaedrus.
You're talking about something from the Phaedrus, Nancy, right?
Yeah, and I don't have it handy, but it's a sort of parable that is offered as an explanation for the tripartite soul in the Phaedrus, and it does. You were explaining that she's pushing against the Platonic view, and I just needed a little more detail. Maybe Roger can cull up the details of it that we need.
I have
even in the
I
cave,
have the cave example here. So she talks about Plato here. I don't have the Phaedrus in front of me. Roger, if you want to try and tease that out, go for it.
No, I think we should. I'm not sure I see the connection with the chariot. The from the Phaedrus, but the cave she talks about in the next chapter on the intramural war between thought and common sense. Nancy,
59 and 60.
Or it's actually on 81 in my book.
Okay.
And the basic premise of the intramural war, which is that on the one hand, philosophers withdraw from the world, and in withdrawing from the world are almost like death, and there's a kind of almost worship of death and love of death among philosophers. They hate their body, they hate time, which decays them. They want to find an immortal truth of some sort. Whereas common sense, she is what she calls that sixth sense that fits us into the world. And so there's a war between them. But what the twist Arendt adds to this is that it's really an intramural war amongst philosophers. Most philosophers don't actually want to die and don't actually want to shuffle off this mortal coil, and they sort of make a big show of it, but they don't actually mean it. It's sort of ironic. And that the war is, she says on page 83, really within the mind of the philosopher himself. There's not a whole lot of, most of the common sense people don't think it's much of a war. And the one story of someone who does is the story I mentioned last time we talked of Thales and who's walking along and falls into a well, and the maiden says, "Oh, Thales, you're so wise. You think you know the stars, but you can't see what's right in front of you." But what Arendt is saying here is that this is largely a war inside the philosopher self. Very few philosophers actually want to commit suicide, as she says on page 84 in one of her humorous remarks. So why does this matter? Why does she have a chapter on this? It's because she really wants to show the depth of the way that philosophical thinking, or not even philosophical thinking of which philosophers are professional representatives, are so, as she says, out of order in the world. I mean, that's the passage in this chapter I'd like. I'm not going to be here for much longer, so I'll just say on page 85, Arendt writes about this, and I thought it would be worth just taking a quick look at it. She says, "Mnemosine, or memory, is the mother of the muses." Sorry, I don't know what that is. Is the mother of the muses, and remembrance, the most frequent and also the most basic thinking experience, has to do with things that are absent, that have disappeared from my senses. And this is so central to Arendt's view of what thinking is, that we think the absent friend, the absent future, the absent past. Yet the absent that is summoned up and made present to my mind, a person, an event, a monument, cannot appear in the way it appeared to my senses, as though remembrance were a kind of witchcraft. In order to appear to my mind only, it must first be desensed. This is a word she uses over and over again in the next 100 pages. And it's just such a shocking word, desensed. And the capacity to transform sense objects into images is called imagination. And here's where she's going to begin to argue that imagination is the core of thinking. She continues, without this faculty of desensing or imagination, which makes present what is absent in a desensed form, no thought process and no trains of thought would be possible at all. This idea of trains of thought is going to come back in the last chapter of the whole book on thinking, so you might want to mark it in that way. It's going to be a very important idea for her. So no trains of thought would be possible at all without desensing and imagination, because in the train of thought, we generalize away from all spatial ideas, and thus we can have this train of thought that goes on infinitum. Hence, and here's the key section I actually wanted to bring us to, hence thinking is out of order, not merely because it stops all the other activities so necessary for the business of living and staying alive, but because it inverts all ordinary relationships. What is near and appears directly to our senses is now far away, and what is distant is actually present. While thinking, I am not where I actually am. I am withdrawn into some never land, she writes. So I just want to me, this is central to what she's doing. Thinking is an affront to common sense. It's an affront to the common sense which fits us into the world. And if we really want to understand this sheer activity of thinking and what thinking is, we have to understand that it is at war with common sense. So why would she then say it's an intramural war and not actually a war? Because she says that really the only people who think about that war are philosophers. Common sense people don't think about that war. They don't ever think about withdrawing from the world of common sense. And so that's in many ways how I understand some of this chapter. I don't know if that So the cave, go back to Nancy's question about the cave. The cave is a flight from the world, and the question is, does the philosopher come back into the cave, and will he will he be killed, as Plato says? And she says that many philosophers are always worried that they're going to be killed by the many, but that this is really a false worry. How many philosophers have been killed by the many? One. And that's the one Plato was worried about. But since then, it hasn't really happened. So I don't know if that helps Nancy with Plato, but that's...
It helps. I mean, I was always struck by the philosopher's decision to come back down to the world of humans, and whether that was a condescension or whether that was, what kind of reentry that was. That's all. I've pondered that for some time, and I have no real answer.
Sam, do you want to pick up, or you want me to go?
No, I can. I mean, well, so just to pick up one of the threads that, Tomar, are you trying to talk?
Yeah, I had a question about this
Are you
passage.
trying to talk? I can't. Okay, now I can hear you. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I had a question about this passage, and it relates to what Nancy was just saying. What does it mean from a political perspective that we imagine our relation to ourselves, our relation to our reflexivity to thinking as happening fully outside the arena of men? What does it mean for let's say from the point of view of deliberation? How could we imagine a deliberative arena in which there is no relation to reflexivity, basically, as I understand her argument, no relation to the ability to think.
So do you mean? So I'm not quite. Let me see if I'm following what you're saying. So I mean, we don't engage in thinking in public in the sense that you're describing it, in the way that Arendt's talking about thinking as an activity that we engage in alone in solitude. If we go back to the beginning of the first section that we had for this week, she talked labor and work and action, and how, so her schema of labor, work, action, and the public realm, and political activity and action which takes place in the public realm is made to appear through language, right? So thinking always deals with invisibles. Thinking deals, which is to say that the activity of thinking itself does not appear in the world. It is made to appear through language. And in that way, thinking does appear. And we can ask that question, how does thinking appear? Metaphor and poetry are two answers that Arendt gives us in these passages. But I'm not sure what the question, if that addresses the question that you're asking.
It does. I think that this would probably represent what Arendt's argument is in this passage. I'm just wondering if this really, first of all, if this is feasible from the perspective of the life of action to relegate.
What is this?
This idea that there is such a division between the moment where we are imagined to be thinking, and then we are in this never land, as she says in this passage. And when we come back and we try to represent, I suppose, our thinking, or in any case, represent a measure of ourselves in a deliberative capacity to others, and
Mm-hmm.
come to a form of understanding with them. What exactly is happening here? What is this switch between these two arenas? And why do we think that that there is such a strong distinction, a hermetic distinction between these two spaces? For her, it's really a spatial division. We are outside the political arena, not just in our thought, but actually somewhere else.
I see.
And then suddenly we
Yeah.
reappear.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's difficult to imagine sometimes I think it's difficult to imagine Arendt's conception of thinking, which is a particular conception of thinking, which is dialogic. It happens in solitude. It requires that we stop. There's a haltung that happens. There's a kind of pause. She uses the metaphor of Socrates and the stingray, right? And we have to, there's a stepping out of the realm of human affairs, the world of appearances, to use her language, that is necessary for us to engage in this kind of thinking activity. And thinking that does not engage in this kind of activity of withdrawal from appearance is, she has other terms for that kind of common sense thinking, mindlessness, philosophical thinking, which appeals to a kind of otherworldliness and then is not responsive to the world of appearance. And it's I think that can be difficult to imagine, but I think it's, for Arendt, it's an incredibly important distinction, and we're not. I think in 2 weeks, not our next section, but it's the last 2 chapters of the thinking volume. I think it's 4 and 5 where she asks the question, where do we go when we think? And for her, it's not just a space question; it's also a time question, because we're caught up in the flow of everyday life, of calendar time, of this recurrent cyclical time, and our lives, in a certain sense, are structured by this calendar time. She says at one point, later on, she'll say, at a certain point, every life, which has a beginning and an end, can be told in a story as such, as having a beginning and an end. But within this ordered time that we occupy, that gives structure to our everyday life, we can engage in this activity of thinking, which is disruptive. It disrupts the flow of ordinary activity and ordinary time by removing us from the world of appearances, so that we can have a necessary distance for engaging in the critical activity of thinking. She calls this, in her lectures on judgment, she calls this lowercase c and t critical thinking. And it's a form of, I always use the phrase self-reflective critical thinking, where we are reflectively representing the world in our imagination, which is the center of our thinking, and engaging with it dialogically. And this is a conscious form of thinking. So, Arendt uses the word ego here, but she's not appealing to any kind of psychoanalysis, and she was very strongly opposed to these traditions, that were the kind of Frankfurt School critical theory, psychoanalytic, neo-Marxist philosophy of the time. She's thinking about the ways in which she calls it the biohistorical narrative self, right? That I, that is shaped by my experiences in the world, engage in a conversation with my consciousness, right? And that reflective conversation. And for her, that's the key, and that requires imagination. And it requires an expansive imagination to do.
Can I mention
can I
something?
jump in on that?
Oh, sorry.
So there's 2
us
people
here.
trying to talk. One of you can go. Okay. Hi, Jason.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out some of the research I've been reading on neurology says that the mind doesn't actually have the wherewithal to distinguish between sensory experience and imagined experience, so that the brain doesn't actually make a distinction, and it will respond. You can have all the emotional responses to an idea, because our brain doesn't bother trying to make a distinction, and that the thinking can happen hermetically. It really can. That's all I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I mean, I think Arendt would obviously disagree with that and trying to think about an activity of critical thinking that we are consciously engaged in. I think one of the critical parts of her political project in writing this book is the emphasis that she places on actual experience, on worldly experience and lived experience. It chimes with her idea that we have to come face to face with the world as it is. And that's how we learn to love the world and engage with the world. And this conception of thinking is not something that just goes on inside of us imaginatively when we might be imagining a scenario in our head, but is an active, conscious thought process that we are actively engaging in. I don't think that many, I think that this is a kind, my assumption is that this is a kind of difficult and rare form of thinking in a certain sense that she's describing, where we draw ourselves into that conversation, not in the flow of our thoughts or absent-mindedly, but consciously, in a form of dialogue.
Can I say something?
Yes? Yeah, there's somebody on the phone. I don't have a name, just a number.
Yeah,
Yeah?
this is Mark. Yeah, I'm on the
Please
phone.
do.
The
Hi, Mark.
one thing I noticed, a little observation, is that she seems to separate out parts of the mind on an equal level, not layered. But apart from that, I'll get into that separately. But one thing I noticed about thinking is
I can't,
that way,
I'm
but
sorry, it cut out for me. I can't hear
Oh,
you.
you're not able to hear me? Can you hear me?
I just heard that, but I hear that, but it cut out for me before.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll talk slowly.
Okay.
So one of the things I noticed is that the thinking part of the mental activity is the part that knows about death. And the emotional parts, the sensory parts, don't. And in that sense, thinking would be associated with death. It's a very different sense than Arendt was talking about.
Well, it's a good, let's go to, I think it's in the second section where she's talking about, in the section on Plato, toward the beginning of the Intramural Warfare, and she's talking about the out of order activity while being engaged in thinking. And this is the first paragraph of that section. He is not immune from common opinion because he shares, after all, in the commonness of all men, and it is his own sense of realness that makes him suspect the thinking activity. And since thinking itself is helpless against the arguments of common sense reasoning, which insist on the meaninglessness of its quest for meaning, the philosopher is liable to answer in common sense terms, which for this purpose he simply turns upside down. And they're talking about the relationship between the body and the soul and what this intramural warfare is, and just to, so common sense and common opinion hold that death is the greatest of all evils. The philosopher of Plato's time, which understood death as the separation of soul from body, will be tempted to say, on the contrary, death is a deity, the constant benefactor of mankind, precisely because it dissolves the union of soul and body. and thus seems to liberate the mind from bodily pain and pleasure, both of which prevent our mental organs from pursuing their activity no less than consciousness prevents our bodily organs from functioning properly. And then, so here Arendt's point about Plato and death, this distinction between the body and the soul, is that the soul, separated from the body, is not subject to the experience of death. But Arendt's drawing a different distinction, as I read it, between the body and the soul. And so whereas Plato or Kant or Hegel are appealing to a kind of transcendental, otherworldly gesture, realm of ideas, in order to think man, Arendt is turning us toward the world of experiences where when the body dies, the soul disappears. Right? So she's going to say there's, I think, in maybe next week or our next meeting, she talks about breath and thinking. We come into the world. Actually, Plato and Aristotle disagreed on this. I think with Plato, we come into the world with an inhalation, and with Aristotle, we come into the world exhalation. But we come into being, with the ruach, with the spirit, the breath of existence. And when we cease to live, we cease to think. And that's this, for Arendt, also the cease of the soul. So that disappearance is, I want to say final. It sounds really severe. When you die, you're dead. And so when we engage in thinking about the world and we approach questions of meaning and being, the fundamental questions of metaphysics that have shaped philosophy from Plato, Parmenides, through Plato, Aristotle, what do we appeal to in answering those questions? For Arendt, it's not a transcendental realm of ideas that escape embodied existence or the world of appearances, but it has to be fundamentally rooted in the world of appearances and our experiences as embodied beings. There are a lot of notes over in the chat box. Margaret asks, can thinking ignite the passions? Can't thinking itself ignite passions? So can thinking ignite the passions? Margaret, I love that question. So, I can answer, and then I can think about it through Arendt and try to give you an Arendtian, it's what we were talking about a little bit ago. Can thinking, so I just want to say yes. It would be my, kind of immediate response that the activity of thinking can excite the passions. That's certainly an experience I have had as an individual in the world. But can thinking, in the sense that Arendt is describing it as an activity, ignite the passions? I'm not sure. I'm not sure in the sense that you're asking it if the answer is yes, because she's talking about a very specific kind of activity of thinking, and she's drawing distinctions between different forms of thinking. And this kind of two-in-one reflective conversation that she's having, that she's talking about when she's talking about thinking, is apart from the passions. But this is a very old philosophical question, and there are certainly many answers to it.
I have a question about that.
Cognitive clarity wasn't. Nancy, are you trying to talk?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify or ask something about thinking and passions.
No, no.
Does it have to do with whether there's feedback? In other words, if thinking in her sense is an afterthought and there's this kind of, representation, is the question whether there's feedback again, like let's say there's an event or an experience, and there's a representation and a reflection and thinking. Does that secondary activity generate different passions after it happens? Or is that clear? I mean,
Yeah, so
like, is there a feedback?
So when we,
is what I was asking.
Mhm. Yeah. So when we retreat to our space of solitude and we actively engage in the process of thinking and we represent our experiences to ourselves in our imagination and engage with them, do we feel something? Is there a kind of feeling that can go along with that? And I mean, sure, but that's not. I think the story from the Theaetetus and Thales and the Thracian girl illustrates that, where you have Thales walking through the square, staring up at the stars, completely enraptured in his own thinking process, so much so that he falls down a well, right? And then he's laughed at, and he responds to that laughter in an active way. So sure, but it's not, I think it's that's a different kind of thinking that is consciously engaged than a simply allowing oneself to be unthinking, carried away, which is a different kind of imaginative activity, So if I go to the opera and I hear a beautiful aria and I move to cry from listening to it, and I am on the train home and I am trying to recreate that affective experience in my imagination, can I elicit that same emotion? I can certainly, represent it to myself in my imagination, and I can be affectively moved, but it's fundamentally a different kind of experience than the actual experience of being in the opera house and listening to the aria. And it's also, I think, a question of whether or not I'm then engaging myself in a conversation about why I was moved to have heard such a beautiful piece of music, or whether or not I'm just seeking to lose myself in the sensation. And, for Arendt, it's not a losing oneself in the sensation, but it's an activity. It's like work. It's like work, sitting down to write. It's something that we do.
Can you hear me at all?
I heard that. So good. So far, so good.
Okay, so by way of a concrete example, I once knew a classics professor who was thinking so hard about something that when he translated, he got so excited he had a heart attack. So it's a dramatic example. It's a very dramatic example, but he loves material. And so I bring that up again because I just have trouble buying these nice, neat, tidy, separate boxes she has. As if, thinking when in solitude and when in the moment and when in and somehow not in any way connected passions or imagination.
Yeah, so imagination is essential to Arendt's conception of thinking. And I'm just so maybe, because some of the people I'm going to plug in my headphones since some of the people on the phone I can't hear as well through my computer speakers. Is that fine for everyone? So one of the things that I always, if I'm like giving an introductory lecture to Arendt, I often say is that, Arendt is a conceptual thinker, and she's constantly drawing distinctions, and they inform and form her work, private, social, public, labor, work, action, the lost treasure of revolution, crises, and so weiter, on and on. But Arendt says, importantly, that these concepts are never ends in themselves. They're always well springs from which we begin the work of thinking. So she's not, whereas Kant, in writing his third critique, is creating a systematic philosophical argument for making aesthetic judgments as synthetic, a priori, and reflective, right? Arendt is not engaging in that kind of systematized philosophy. She's not a systems thinker. She's a conceptual thinker. And so she's engaging with the concept of metaphysics here in this book, and she's engaging with the fundamental problems of metaphysics as they've been talked about within the tradition of Western political philosophy. And she's not writing a philosophical system to counter Kant or Hegel or even Heidegger. What she's doing is engaging the concepts and thinking with them and through them in order to offer a critique of the ways in which philosophers have traditionally thought about the activity of thinking. And so these conceptual distinctions that she's drawing in order to make her argument are not, I always use the word spongy. I always think of her conceptual distinctions as spongy. They're not hard and fast lines in the sense that they're operating like ontological principles or, first principles. She's not doing that. She's not engaging in that kind of work. And that's one of the reasons why she understands herself not to be a philosopher in that way. She draws a distinction between the activity of theory and thinking, between political philosophy and thinking as distinct activities. And I understand her work and thinking here and the way that she approaches common sense and the sixth sense, which allows us to make sense of our experiences, as a kind of almost democratization of thinking, where thinking, traditionally belongs to the realm of philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Thales walking down the street, the stargazing, the being so caught up in thinking that you die or fall down a well. But thinking is something that we can all engage in. And the truth that the philosophers, hold on to, she's pushing against that too in the second section on the intramural warfare. That these debates about thinking, about the knowledge and eros and truth are being had amongst Plato and Aristotle and Heidegger and Kant. And she's trying to think about thinking from the activity of thinking, and to think about, she says at the outset of this project that, none of these philosophers who have talked about thinking have actually described the process of and what it means for us to engage in the activity of thinking. And that's part of her political project here.
One in Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt refers to thinking quite a bit and talks about the suppression of thinking as a method, as a prerequisite for gaining control over people. And so I wonder if exactly how this thinking that Arendt is talking about, as you say, a specific kind of thinking, how that enables one to resist brainwashing. I don't see that.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So she talks about thinking a lot across her work. Thinking is a fundamental idea in Arendt's work, and she makes a negative claim on thinking, that thinking can prevent evil in the world, which comes through in her idea of the banality of evil in Eichmann. But so for There are a couple of answers to that question as it relates to Origins and then this idea of brainwashing. So at the end of Origins, in the last 10 pages, when she's talking about loneliness, which also comes up in our passages from today, she says that loneliness is the common ground of totalitarianism. Why? Because when one is lonely, one cannot engage in thinking. And in Origins, she describes that in this kind of thinking. In Origins, she describes that as a kind of, a longing for meaning in that loneliness. Loneliness is when we are cut off from the world, from our relationships with others. And so we become desperate for meaning, which makes us particularly susceptible to ideology, which offers an easy solution or answer to the problems that we're facing. She defines isms in those pages as any kind of, totalizing ideological narrative that offers one argument that answers all the questions. And so we become susceptible to ideology when we're lonely, because we're cut off from the world and we can't think. Thinking so the other great, another great example that she talks about in Origins, but the great metaphor that comes through in her interview with Joachim Fest is she describes Eichmann as talking to a brick wall. So, and she says, people misunderstood what I meant by the banality of evil. I did not mean that Eichmann doesn't think. Of course Eichmann thought, and he was a very good thinker in a certain way, but he lacked the imaginative capacity, which for Arendt, that's why, and one of the reasons why imagination is at the center of her concept of thinking here, the idea that we have to go wandering, to have an expansive imagination, to imagine ourselves from the viewpoint of another. That's why talking to Eichmann was like talking to a brick wall, because he was unable to imagine the world from the perspective of another. He was incapable of this kind of imaginative thinking, and that was evidenced through the language that he used, through the cliches and the stale metaphors, the worn out verbiage. And so in that sense, thinking imaginatively, in the sense that she describes it as a kind of going wandering, to borrow from Kant, also makes us less susceptible to ideology for Arendt. There are a number of answers to that question. Those, I think, are two of the most important ones. So she talks about, I'm always struck that she uses the word stupid so much, but she talks about mindlessness. She talks about a kind of stupid, thinking that is not engaged, thinking that is characterized by an absence of thinking language. She was fond of saying that you could tell how smart a person was by the kind of language they chose to use. And by that, she doesn't mean in a kind of technical way, but in the sense that one had the capacity to think critically. Does that help?
Really? It seems to be contradictory, because on the one hand, she makes it sound like thinking is an isolation from the world, that you separate out from the world. I thought she was referring to that explicitly in this book. I see. Yeah. Whereas,
Mm-hmm.
But you're really talking now about thinking as a way of connecting to the world. That if you're thinking, you're not lonely. You may be alone, but you're not lonely. So it seems a little contradictory.
Precisely.
And I guess I just want to say about my bottom line, I wonder if other people have this issue too. Can you identify when you're Arendt thinking? When you're thinking like the kind of thinking that Arendt is talking about? I'm not sure I can. Maybe I don't think. Maybe that's the problem. But at any rate, I wonder about that.
Well, I don't know. I've never met you, so I'm going to refrain from judgment. But sorry, it's a joke. But so I think that's a really good point. And so Arendt draws a distinction between loneliness. It's not a contradiction. It's a different understanding of what it means to engage in the activity of thinking and what that requires. So Arendt draws a distinction between loneliness and solitude. And loneliness is a condition in which we are completely cut off from a feeling of connection to the world around us, where that interesse, that plurality of the human condition falls away, and we feel ourselves to be alone in the world. But solitude is when we are alone, and joyfully so, with ourselves, and able to engage in the activity of thinking. Now, when she says withdrawal from the world, she means that in a specific sense. So in Origins, when she's talking about the concentration camp as an abyss of disappearance where one is disappeared from the world, for her, this is the fundamental crime against humanity, to willfully remove somebody from the world of appearances, which is radically different than the kind of remove she's talking about when she's describing thinking here in The Life of the Mind. So she says that thinking as an activity does not appear in the world, but it is conditioned by our appearance in the world. And this is one of the fundamental claims that she's making against the traditional philosophers, who would like to remove themselves from the world of appearances, from their embodied condition, so that they can reach some transcendental realm of truth and ideas, right? That's why she says it's like death, right? What the philosophers want to do in that sense is closer to death, right? Because they want to leave the world. But I'm sorry, death is a fundamental fact of our human existence. We all appeared in the world, and we're all going to disappear from the world, right? And these facts of our human condition shape and inform the way that we think about the world. And to try and find a way out of that would be denying of the human condition somehow. And so when Arendt says that we remove ourselves from the world when we engage in the act of thinking, which deals with these non-visibles, right? Imaginatively, remembering, reflectively, we are very much rooted in the world. We are very much rooted in the world. And that thinking for her fundamentally requires appearance in the world, right? So, I'm appearing digitally now before you, as you are, but most of you, I can see most of you before me. Maybe afterwards you'll go into your study or you'll go for a walk and you'll engage in a conversation about this conversation with yourself, and you'll, think about the ideas that we've been talking about. And that's, you haven't disappeared from the world when you're still very much a part of the world. And so they're two radically different kinds of disappearance in the way that Arendt is talking about them. And it's importantly one of the ways that she's pushing against the philosophers. Daphna, is that you?
It is me.
Is that your voice?
For some reason, I've been blocked from video. So I just wanted to ask, the collection that we're reading, which is, you can't see me, but it's The Life of the Mind. I think a lot of it was put together posthumously. Is that right?
Yes, it was. It was the edition that you have, the only edition that exists for now, was edited primarily by Mary McCarthy, and also with the help of Jerome Cohn.
Right. So
and
the
a couple
point
of others. Yes.
So this wasn't actually something that she worked on and edited for publication herself. So that was one of my.
So.
All right,
that's not quite right. So just.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I just finish my 3 points and then you could correct all three?
Sure, that works for me.
Okay, I find that throughout all of the writings of hers that I've read diligently, the concept of thinking is pervasive, and it's a work in progress. It's not like that she has reached the ultimate conclusion about thinking at any one of her pieces of writing. It's always something that there's more to do about. So I find that by picking on certain aspects of her analysis here, as though it were a biblical truth, is not really the point, because she changes and evolves, and she actually says that thinking is not ever complete. You don't reach the end of it. So I thought that maybe part of the problem that we're having in understanding some of the distinctions between thinking and passion and all of these others are because she is, as she's writing these things, she's working them out herself, since she claims it's a never completed mission. So I'd like to think of it that way. Now, I'm not sure if she did edit all these things, but you're going to correct me and teach me about that. And also, can I just make a point that it would be really helpful if we could use the same text? Because I spent like the first 20 minutes just searching for where you were when you quoted that passage. Not that I want to be a spoilsport, but thanks.
Yeah. No. So yeah, I have a digital edition that I'm working from. So The Life of the Mind was Arendt's last text, and it was, just to start with the first point, it is comprised of 3 volumes, was intended to be comprised of 3 volumes: Thinking, Willing, and Judging. And she finished Willing I believe the day before she died. And on the day that she died, the first page of Judging was found in the register of her typewriter with the 2 epigraphs. So of the text that we have, Thinking is the most, I'll say, that's a horrible formulation, but it's the most edited of the 3 volumes that we had. She gave a version, so a lot of the material in Thinking that we're reading now was already published in her essay Thinking and Moral Considerations, and the other essay on thinking. She gave a version of the Thinking volume as the Gifford Lectures in 1973, 74, and then she gave a course in 1974 at the New School for Social Research on thinking, and she had edited it by hand and marked it up. I was actually just in the Library of Congress for a week, and I was looking at the original manuscript that was worked with at the time of her death, and she used to cut and like Scotch tape things together, and she made a lot, there are a lot of annotations and marks, and so those were when this volume that we have was published, those edits that Arendt had made on the text were incorporated into the published document. Now there are various versions of this text, and I've looked at a number of them. Right now, the critical edition volume of this text is being put together, and I think will be out in 2020 or 2021. And so you'll be able to see in that where McCarthy's edits differ from what Arendt has on the page. But of the 3, this is I think the closest to a finished text, and she You're absolutely right, Daphne. And I couldn't agree more that on 2 points that you made. So I'm only correcting one really, that the that the thinking is very much at the heart of what Arendt is doing. And she is continuously engaging in the activity of thinking. So I'm writing a biography of Arendt right now, and so I've been systematically rereading all of her correspondences, and I'm struck by how central thinking is from, the time she's 18, to her final work, and is present. She goes to Marburg to study with Heidegger because he's teaching thinking. She says that in a number of places. And if you she's always she's interested in the idea of the activity of thinking. I mean, among many other things as well, of course, but it is something that stays with her throughout the course of her life. And if you go in the Thinking Without a Banister volume, Sherry Cohn beautifully edited, and you look at the essay she wrote for Heidegger on the occasion of his 80th birthday, which is all about thinking. She has this, great passage that if like the greatest, hopefully one lives long enough that they're able to rethink everything that they've ever written. So absolutely. And, that's one of the points I was trying to emphasize. I was saying that she's not a systematic political philosopher in the way that Kant is in developing his tripartite distinction between pure reason, practical reason, and judgment. She's not giving us a system. She's approaching thinking as an activity that never comes to an end, that we always engage with. And so the thinking of thinking also is something that never reaches an end, in the sense that it might be easier for us to grasp her conceptualization of thinking in that sense if it were, but it remains in that kind of elusive space. There's a quote that I love that illustrates this at the beginning of Benjamin's epistemo-critical prologue in The Origin of German Drama, was that we always approach the object of contemplation in return. He actually says the mode most proper for contemplation is the pausing for breath, which allows us to approach, right? But we never actually get at. There's no grasping. It doesn't become a concept in the sense then that we can pick it up and utilize it as that kind of philosophical framework. But it's this kind of dance almost of pausing, approaching, retreating, pausing, approaching, retreating, that we engage with. And that requires an expansive imagination, and the process and engaging in that process expands the imagination, I think, which is one of the reasons why imagination is so central to Arendt's conceptualization of thinking. There are a lot of questions over, and I'm looking in the chat box. It's quite long. We have about 12 minutes left, so let me go through some of these. Who can turn off thinking as if a light switch? I think we kind of touched on that a little bit. What, Margaret?
Oh, I'm agreeing with you. Yes, we did. You can keep going.
Okay. So I'm gonna. Okay. Ken agrees with Margaret. Jason, crazy idea. Soul rests in labor, the passions of anima laborans, but thinking arises as a work, an assembly, even though fundamentally impermanent. Why so crazy? Soul rests in labor. Well, I think. I mean, I wouldn't say this so definitively and try to appropriate soul and thinking into Arendt's categories of human activity in this way. But this volume is she understands to be the what's the after volume? I can't think of the word. It's the volume that follows the human condition, which was about the activities of acting in the world of appearances, and this is about the activity of thinking. But I think in the kind of unthinking, repetitive, laboring, mindlessness, flow of thoughts, and certainly there's a correlation there. And thinking, like work, is an activity that we actively engage in. But thinking doesn't, importantly, this is a very important distinction. Work makes things. So I sit down and I write a book, and you have a book to read. Thinking never produces anything. Thinking exists outside of the means ends categories. We don't make things when we think. Now we can transform our thinking into thought things, right? Which then appear in the world through language. And she says in The Human Condition that poetry is the closest form we have to thinking itself, right? But thinking itself never appears in the world. Work does. 10, I'm just going to kind of slide through the questions. 10 says, I think that Arendt's separation of mind and soul was shown to be less true, especially understanding of cognitive therapy, and yet I don't think that matters with her arguments about will and judgment. Does this make sense? So Arendt's separation of mind and soul was shown. Honestly, I don't know that much about cognitive therapy. I know a little bit more about, I think, analysis. Ken, do you want to maybe
real quick thing about
out for me? Yep.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? This is Ken.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I know we've been beating this to death, so I don't want to go on too long about it, but the link between mind and emotions, mind and soul, as she sees it, and the conversation just before that we were having, that her thinking was continuing to evolve, and had she lived to today, it would continue to evolve more. And cognitive therapy was just, I think even before the 80s, if somebody had depression or somebody had anxiety, they just thought of it as, like bad humor or something, however people thought about it back then. But, then the link with, it's actually our thoughts are really controlling our emotions a lot. And, maybe tease it apart and it's, not really thinking emotion, whatever. It's kind of like, it bothered me from the very beginning, but the way I dealt with it was, at the beginning of the book was, I think it's leading to this whole thing about will, where you kind of want to overcome or, your emotions and go in a different direction through will. And that's still valid. So, and so is judgment. So in a way, it's like, it doesn't matter. So I've kind of told myself, I'm just going to set that whole thing aside. Maybe it's just like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. She was going really deep with that, and there's all these other really good insights. And so that's what I was asking. Does that make sense? Yeah. Or am I like really missing something? Yeah. That's where I'm coming at.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And there's just the one sentence in this section where she says that, unless you really practice it, controlling the emotions, then they're just kind of in their thing. But to me, that implies that for her, we can engage with them. But it's not something that we necessarily do or is easy to do, but it's something that has to be learned up, and that we have to train ourselves in that. And yes, in willing, I think we'll get to a different aspect that is, occupying the space between the invisible realm of thinking and the world of appearances, where we have those essential experiences, and how we will our actions and the thought behind our actions and our experiences. And so I'll skip over Thinking for Arendt is involuntary and voluntary. It's both. She talks about the different kinds, mindlessness, a kind of unthinkingness, and then she talks about critical thinking. And here she's talking about this self-reflective critical thinking that we can actively engage with, but there's certainly involuntary thinking as well, in her distinctions. Didn't something awful happen to Galileo? Jason, do you wanna add to that, or should I leave that? And
just speaking very basically, I mean, it wasn't Socrates alone who found himself in front of a tribunal of sorts. There were others who have since faced difficult times. That's all I wanted to note.
sure. And I think, so Arendt's, the point that Roger was emphasizing earlier, where the philosophers want to position themselves against the common man, and that there's this kind of fear that they'll be killed by the common man is absurd, is important. But it's also, Arendt emphasizes that thinking is dangerous. Thinking in itself is dangerous, she says. And thinking in itself is dangerous because it disrupts the beliefs system, what meaning we have. It can disrupt the way that we think about the world. And that's always been a very dangerous activity. And certainly more than Socrates have been persecuted for engaging in an act of thinking that challenges a status quo. So I would agree with you there. I think we talked about Nancy's
You can
question.
probably skip mine. I think you can skip
Okay.
mine. It's really not a very good question.
Ken asked another question. Carefully about what you're about to tweet rather than just hitting the keyboard. Oh, Twitter is this whole special realm of communication, I think, that requires a different kind of utilitarian thinking, and we're probably not at our most critical thinking selves when we're using Twitter. I'm, of course, thinking of one one person in particular, but I would not say that Twitter is the realm of critical thinking that Arendt is conceptualizing. I imagine Arendt, I don't know, I've thought a lot about this. Would Arendt, I mean, I think Benjamin would have really loved Twitter. I don't know if Arendt would have been amenable.
Could I make a comment about that?
Yes?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, go for it.
I think it offers a great opportunity to practice thinking, So it's like you want to respond right away, and like you could really let me really think about what I'm going to say. It's like, well, how different is that? Yeah. And and practice it.
And you have a word limit, so you have to edit.
Yeah. So you could act. I don't know. That's what I've been trying to do instead of just putting stuff out there on Facebook, and it's so but so then if that's true, then if it is a chance to do that, then the next thought in my mind was then, okay, thinking's supposed to lead to meaning, right? So like, okay, where's that? How does that work? Just sort of think about that.
Well, I think that tweeting is like thinking in haiku.
So form, a limitation of form can certainly birth creativity and thought. And
that would be poetry, right? So.
Yes, that would be certain forms of poetry. I think the Twitter question is a fascinating question. I'm echoing to myself. I'm going to take these out. Okay, so just because we are there any? So we're pretty much out of time. Let me just slide through. Is it a desire for a meaning in life, or is it a Meyer aptly expressed as a desire for an experience of life? I'm not sure what the it is at the begin in the question. To be able to actively participate in life, we can do this and be aware, think, reflect in that participation. But does this not bring a sense of a thought about what we are doing with life? I feel meaning of life is not possible. I feel meaning of life is not possible. That's a very, very I'm gonna go back up before that, Joanna. I think so. One of the things that Arendt emphasizes in one of the passages that I read at the beginning is that we find ourselves thinking about our experience of a moment in the moment, we've already absent ourselves from the presence of the experience. And when we do that, we're kind of pulling back and turning away from the world. And I think that's a fairly common experience, I would assume, that most people have had, where you find yourself, let's say, in a social exchange where you feel yourself pulling inward, away from the connectiveness to the others around you in the immediacy of the situation, because you're thinking about some other experience, some other thing, or because you're thinking about the moment that you're in. And once you become cognizant of that in a thinking way, you're no longer participating in that sense. I feel meaning of life is not possible. I think Kafka said the meaning of life is that it stops. I think there's meaning of life for Arendt, though. And I think, to read that, I just think of Amor Mundi. I think of, this incredible Warum ist es so schwer, die Welt zu lieben? Why is it so difficult to love the world? And this imperative that we have to love the world. And I think that contains a lot of meaning for Arendt, and is also central to her project. We are out of time. I will thank you, everybody. The conversation went by way too quickly today. So much to talk about. And we'll see you again in, I think it's 2 weeks. Let me just pull that up. And no, it's not gonna. Oh. Yes, so we will meet again in 2 weeks on July 26th, and we will talk more about activity and the relationship between language and metaphor and the spectator. So I'm looking forward to seeing you on the 26th. Thank you for reading Hannah Arendt with us, and enjoy reading The Life of the Mind.